and people probably started to forget that we were there. So I said, well, why not do another festival? And it was kind of about time, and also coincided with the 25th year of its inception.
With a connection that went beyond the realm of music, Eric Clapton and George Harrison, two of the most legendary guitarists and songwriters of the 1960s and 1970s, were closely connected. 1964 was the year that they first met. While Harrison was a member of the Beatles, Clapton was one of the members of the Yardbirds. Because of their shared appreciation for blues music, they ended up becoming fast friends very quickly. One of the most well-known guitar solos ever recorded was performed by Eric Clapton on the album While My Guitar Gently Weeps, which was one of the many legendary projects that the duo worked together on. In addition, during their trip to India in 1968, they also discussed Indian music and spirituality with one another. In spite of the fact that their friendship was strong, it was about to be put to the test by a complicated love triangle that involved Harrison's wife, Pattie Boyd. This love triangle was so complicated that it almost caused them to break up. In order to prepare ourselves for the shocking revelation that Clapton made about Harrison, let us take a moment to pause and think about the incredible connection that they shared, the friendship between Eric and George. Beginning in the 1960s, Eric Clapton and George Harrison developed a friendship that would go on to become one of the most iconic relationships in the history of rock and roll. During the Christmas show that the Beatles were performing at the Hammersmith Odeon in December 1964, Clapton's band, the Yardbirds, provided support for the Fab Four. This was the first time that Clapton had the opportunity to interact with the Beatles. As a result of this connection, Clapton was introduced to Harrison, and the two musicians connected immediately, resulting in the formation of a profound personal and professional relationship that would endure for hundreds of years. There was more to Clapton's involvement with the Beatles than those two things. He worked together with the band as a whole, as well as individually with each member on their individual projects, and he became deeply involved with the band as a whole. It is well known that he played the lead guitar on the song While My Guitar Gently Weeps by George Harrison, which was included on the White Album. He therefore left an indelible mark on one of the most cherished songs by the Beatles. According to John Lennon, his closeness to the band was so significant that he was once considered as a possible replacement for George Harrison during the time that Harrison was temporarily absent from the band. However, the friendship he shared with Harrison was the one that lasted. The friendship between Clapton and Harrison expanded beyond the realm of music as time went on. They became the best of friends, not only because they had a common interest in playing the guitar, but also because they had a similar approach to navigating the chaotic world of rock stardom. The fact that they ended up having a connection with Pattie Boyd, which was even more personal, proved to be a surprising development in their friendship. During the height of Beatlemania in 1966, Boyd, who was married to Harrison at the time, became a source of inspiration for some of the most famous love songs in the history of rock and roll. The song Something About Her was written by Harrison, and it is widely regarded as one of the Beatles' most excellent love songs. Nevertheless, their marriage started to suffer as a result of Harrison's infidelity and Boyd's growing feelings of insecurity because of the situation. During this time period, Clapton, who had developed a deep affection for Boyd, famously fell in love with the wife of his best friend. Boyd was the beneficiary of this love affair. Layla, a passionate outpouring of his feelings, and Wonderful Tonight, which further cemented Boyd's place as one of rock's most famous muses, were both written by him as a result of his unrequited love for Boyd. In 1977, Boyd eventually parted ways with Harrison, and shortly thereafter, she and Clapton tied the knot. Following that, we will have a more in-depth discussion about their love triangle, which is a toxic love triangle. Pattie Boyd recounts her life as the inspiration for two of the most successful musicians in the history of rock music in her book, Wonderful Tonight. On the other hand, what begins as a story about a fairy tale quickly transforms into a cautionary tale. The years go by, and Boyd reveals shocking insights into the darker side of the rock and roll lifestyle of the 1960s and 1970s. Boyd shares moments of joy, but as the years pass, she reveals these insights. After a traumatic experience with Eric Clapton, she describes feeling like a complete and utter fool while sitting on her bed, shaking and tears streaming down her face. She describes how she felt like a complete and utter fool. Boyd also reflects on the lessons she learned and how she fought to overcome her darkest times. despite the fact that some of the stories are disturbing. Many people were taken aback by the emotionally distressing details of her life with George Harrison and Eric Clapton when she finally broke her silence after 40 years of having kept it. Boyd's life demonstrates that fame, excess, and creativity can sometimes lead to harmful behavior. This is illustrated by the legendary music and talent that Boyd brings to the table. It was a wonderful beginning to Boyd and George Harrison's marriage, which took place in January of 1966. During his time away on tour, George was attentive to her, and he frequently called and wrote to her. Boyd cherished her life as a young model married to a Beatle in swinging London, and they enjoyed exciting vacations and exclusive parties together. Boyd was a part of the entertainment industry. Nevertheless, she also observed that other women were consistently present in their lives from time to time. Things took a dramatic turn for the better after they returned from their trip to India in 1968, when George developed an unhealthy obsession with meditation and the spiritual figure Krishna. To Boyd's utter surprise, he revealed his desire to live a life similar to that of Krishna, in which he would be surrounded by young concubines and no woman would be off limits. The more George immersed himself in his spiritual practices, the more distant and angry he became. He began chanting constantly and withdrew from Boyd. Her feelings of isolation and depression were exacerbated by the fact that he frequently ignored her. As Boyd and George returned home on New Year's Day, 1969, they discovered that Eric Clapton's girlfriend, a French woman whom they knew, had been staying at their house after Clapton had kicked her out. This occurred after Boyd and George had celebrated the previous night. Because of the woman's growing closeness to George, Boyd felt compelled to confront him. As soon as she expressed her worries, George dismissed her and accused her of being paranoid. Boyd, who was in terrible pain, went to stay with his friends. The woman was left feeling miserable and unloved as a result of the betrayal, which George discovered 6 days later when he called to inform him that the woman had left and Boyd had returned home. At the same time, Boyd describes how Jane Asher, Paul McCartney's longtime girlfriend, unexpectedly returned home from New York to discover that Paul was currently in a relationship with another woman. Asher, in contrast to Boyd, took immediate action, bringing her mother over and removing all of her belongings from the house, leaving Paul behind. It was the first time that George had ever done something like this, but when he started wearing sandalwood to attract women, his behavior took an unexpected turn. He started staying late at the Apple offices where there were always attractive women present, and he went so far as to not return home at all many times. Whenever Pattie inquired about it, he would assert that he had done nothing wrong and accuse her of being unreasonable, suspicious, and unpleasant. Pattie was left feeling helpless and increasingly isolated from George's life as a result of this decision. Pattie started taking on additional modeling gigs and even enrolled in art classes with a friend in order to keep herself occupied. Her achievement of landing a 5-page spread in Italian Vogue with Twiggy was one of the moments that made her the most proud. In addition to that, she began a small antique business with her sister Jenny, who was married to Mick Fleetwood, and she began taking photographs with a camera that George had given her as a Christmas present. Juniper was the name of the stall that they established on King's Road, which specialized in Art Nouveau items. The name was chosen in honor of Donovan's song Jennifer Juniper, which he had written for Jenny during their trip to India, which marked the beginning of a potentially dangerous love triangle. It was around this time that George's friend Eric Clapton, who is also a musician, began paying a greater number of visits to their residence. Eric was shy and reserved, but Pattie found him to be captivating when he was performing on stage. It was during this time that Clapton was in a relationship with Charlotte, a French model. Charlotte would go on to become Jimmy Page's girlfriend and the mother of his first child. As a result of Pattie's perception that George had neglected her, she was unable to ignore Eric's attention. In ways that George no longer did, he would compliment her cooking, make an attempt to sit next to her, and stare at her in peculiar ways. Eric's interest made Pattie feel a sense of flattery, and she took pleasure in the attention that she was not receiving from her husband. After some time, Eric began a relationship with Paula, Pattie's sister, and she eventually moved in with him. Despite this, it was abundantly clear that Eric's feelings for Pattie had not shifted in any way. She received an urgent letter addressed to Pattie Harrison one day after George and Pattie had moved into Friar Park. The letter was addressed to Pattie Harrison. There was a brief note inside that was written in all lowercase letters. expressing profound feelings, and signed with the words, "All my love, E." Pattie took it to her friends because she was under the impression that it was from a rabid fan. Later that evening, however, Eric picked up the phone to verify that it was indeed from him, thereby revealing his genuine feelings for her. During the beginning stages of their relationship, Eric made a purchase for her that was a pair of bell-bottom jeans. This occurred during one of their outings together. Later on, Eric took her to the apartment of a friend in order to perform a song that he had written called Layla. The song was a result of his love for her that was not reciprocated. Pattie referred to the song as the most potent and emotionally moving piece of music that she had ever experienced listening to. While Eric played it over and over again, he carefully observed her reaction. She found herself unable to resist him any longer because the emotional weight of the song overpowered her, and despite her fears that everyone would know that it was about her, she ultimately gave in. One evening, while they were attending a party, George discovered them in the garden, which brought about a more dramatic turn in their affair. "How are things going?" It was George who inquired. Having reached the point where he could no longer conceal his emotions, Eric exclaimed, "Man, I have to tell you that I am in love with your wife." Pattie, who was terrified, departed with George. In spite of this, Eric continued on. "And then, when I realized that we had, he continued to show up at their house whenever George was away, pleading with her to run away with him. He did this regardless of whenever George was away. There was a point in time when Eric even threatened to start using substances if she did not leave George for it. In accordance with his promise, Eric went into a drug-induced stupor that lasted for a number of years. For the purpose of recording Layla, he traveled to Miami. He then played the recording for Paula, Pattie's sister, and Paula immediately recognized that it was about Pattie. Paula, who was emotionally devastated, packed her belongings and moved out of Eric's house, leaving behind the intricate web of relationships that she had been a part of. In the year 1973, George and Pattie intended to take a trip to Portugal together for their vacation. However, George informed her that he was not feeling well the day before they were scheduled to leave, and he requested that she cancel the trip. Pattie, on the other hand, made the decision to travel to the Bahamas with her cousin and two of her siblings. George went to Spain with Chrissy Wood, the wife of Ronnie Wood, in order to visit Salvador Dali while she was away. Chrissy Wood would accompany George. George dismissed Pattie's concerns and accused her of being paranoid when she confronted him about his trip. Pattie confronted George about his trip. Although Ronnie Wood did not appear to be bothered by the fact that his wife had gone out with George, he did find it amusing that the two of them had gone to see Dali together. Despite the circumstances, Ronnie and Pattie would continue to be friends for the rest of their lives. On the other hand, the moment that Pattie found out that George had been having an affair with Maureen, Ringo Starr's wife, was the final straw for her. As a result of the fact that Maureen and Pattie had been close friends during the time of the Beatles, this betrayal is considerably more painful. Pattie returned home from spending the weekend with her mother, where she discovered photographs that provided evidence of the affair. One of the things that Maureen was wearing was a necklace that George had given her. She had been staying at their house. Within the confines of a bedroom, Pattie discovered George and Maureen locked in together one night. She repeatedly knocked on the door, but George did nothing but laugh. As soon as he emerged from his hiding place, he asserted that Maureen was simply exhausted and lying down. When Pattie finally reached her breaking point, she removed George's OM flag and replaced it with a Crossbones flag, which provided her with a momentary feeling of satisfaction. Despite the fact that she claimed she was there to listen to George play in the studio, Maureen continued to show up at their house late into the night. One morning, when Maureen was still present, Pattie confronted her about her actions and asked her about her children. She also asked her about her children. The response that Maureen gave, however, was icy. In an effort to alleviate her frustration, Pattie called Ringo and informed him of the situation. As soon as Ringo learned about the actions of his wife, he became extremely angry. Eric and Pattie's romantic relationships. Eric Clapton didn't stop his pursuit of Pattie, even as the situation became increasingly chaotic. George, who dismissed any allegations of affairs by calling her paranoid and crazy, made her feel as though she was not loved and that she had been betrayed. Pattie had the impression that George wanted to end their marriage, but he was unable to bring himself to say it outright. George became increasingly difficult to communicate with. They were getting ready to go to a party with one of George's friends on New Year's Eve in 1974 when Pattie realized that she had forgotten something inside. The party was going to be that night. Upon her return to the vehicle, she discovered that George and his friend had vanished without her. She was so determined to go that she actually drove herself through the dense fog, and she spent New Year's Eve with people she had never met before. In a casual manner, George suggested that we get a divorce this year when she finally showed up at the party. Ringo made an effort to comfort her by presenting her with the opportunity to take photographs of him while he was performing the role of Merlin the Magician in Son of Dracula, a musical comedy written by Harry Nilsson. George, however, made a public declaration in front of their friends that he was in love with Ringo's wife during a dinner party that was held at Ringo's house. This was a pivotal moment in the history of the situation. Despite his devastation, Ringo continued to insist that nothing is real. Pattie did not immediately leave George, despite the humiliation that she had experienced. The marriage continued despite the fact that she dyed her hair red. Almost immediately after that, Pattie returned home one day to discover George, Eric Clapton, and Pete Townshend engaged in a profound conversation. Once more, Eric took her aside and pleaded with her to abandon George in favor of going with him. After waiting for a few weeks, Pattie broke the news to George that she was leaving. George climbed into bed with her that night and begged her not to leave, but it was already too late for Pattie to do anything about it. Almost immediately after that, she joined Eric on tour, where she stood on the side of the stage and watched the crowd erupt in excitement when he played the opening riff to Layla. From the beginning, it seemed like a fairy tale, but it didn't take long before the harsh reality of life on a tour from coast to coast became apparent. Pattie found herself living out of her suitcases, traveling between hotels and airports, staying up late to go to bed, and then waking up to do whatever she had just done again. Drinking was Eric's way of coping, and she eventually joined in on the fun. These are the best of friends. She entered a hotel room one evening to discover Eric and another man alone with strippers. She was surprised to see them. Eric placed the blame for her outburst on his friend when she went all out. She found herself making these disheartening discoveries on a consistent basis throughout her life. At a later time, when she goes back to Friar Park to retrieve her belongings from George, he behaves in a way that is both pleasant and sad, which causes her to feel guilty. Because of this, she began to question whether or not she had made the correct choice in deciding to leave him. As more time passed with Eric, Pattie started drawing parallels between him and George. Eric's upbringing was significantly more complicated than George's, despite the fact that both had grown up in working-class families. George came from a loving and close-knit family. Due to the fact that she had him at the age of 16 with a married Canadian Air Force man, Eric grew up believing that his mother was his sister. The fact that his grandmother had been pretending to be his mother for a number of years until they finally revealed the truth to him left him feeling bewildered and uneasy. Pattie's family had a deep affection for George, and he was attentive to their needs. On the other hand, Eric was more rough around the edges, and her family never took to him in the same way that they did to her. When it came to interaction with other people, George thrived at dinners and gatherings, whereas Eric was more antisocial unless he had been drinking. Whenever he finished his meal, Eric would frequently get up from the table to watch television or play the guitar, leaving the other people to finish their meals. While Eric left his clothes and belongings strewn across the floor, George maintained a neat and orderly appearance. George even paid a visit to Pattie without prior notice on Christmas, and he was taken aback to discover that she had resumed her consumption of meat after adhering to a strict vegetarian diet for many years. In spite of the awkwardness, they had a pleasant time together, which made it abundantly clear that George had been lonely on Christmas, which was most likely the reason he had come by. When I was at home with Eric, we would frequently throw parties and drink significantly. On a particular evening, Eric was playing around on his guitar while she was taking a considerable amount of time getting ready for a party. After she had finally made her way into the room, he began playing the first line of Wonderful Tonight for her. The couple appeared to be deeply in love and had a good time for a while. But soon after, Eric's drinking became out of control, which resulted in him experiencing seizures related to alcohol withdrawal. As a result of Eric's decision to prohibit wives and girlfriends from accompanying him on tour, Pattie was forced to remain at home by herself, which became her typical routine. To keep herself occupied, she made friends with a pair of identical twin models. After one of the models had spent the night, Pattie awoke one morning to discover that the model and Eric had gone shopping together. Pattie was surprised to get this information. She found them sitting on the couch in a comfortable position when she returned home at a later time. She inquired about the situation as she was stunned. "Can't you see that we're having a really intense and intimate conversation here?" Eric, who was under the influence of alcohol, responded. "Because I'm in love with this girl," he said in response to her question about the reason. "Get out of here and give us some space. Stop being such a jerk." Pattie was immediately brought back to the time when George had humiliated her with the French girl after the New Year's Eve party. Not only was she stunned, but she also lacked the ability to articulate her thoughts. Due to the realization that she had given up George for this, she went upstairs in a state of shock and sat on the bed. Tears began to stream down her face as she sat there. She departed and went to visit her sister Jenny, who had also left McFleetwood and had returned to England with her daughters. Jenny had also arrived in England. Some solace was found by Pattie and Jenny, and she thought to herself, "Thank God I have Jenny." After a couple of days had passed, she called Eric to deliver the news that she would be absent for a period of time. In response, Eric said in a nonchalant manner, "Good, we need a break." It was acknowledged by him that her friend was still present. After that, Pattie gathered her belongings and left for a period of several weeks, during which she stayed at the residence of a friend in Los Angeles. Pattie came to the conclusion that she would not go back to Eric, and she started making plans for the rest of her life. When she woke up one morning, a friend informed her that Eric had called her in the middle of the night and inquired about the possibility of marrying her immediately on Tuesday, just prior to his next tour in Tucson. She reluctantly gave her consent. There were only 3 days left to plan the wedding, so they had to rush to get everything ready for the last-minute wedding. Her sister and a few friends also attended the wedding in a hurry. After some time had passed, Pattie came to the realization that the entire wedding was predicated on a wager that Eric and a friend had made. A friend of his had placed a wager that he would be able to get Eric's photograph published in the newspaper. As part of the scheme, the friend called the newspapers to announce a fictitious wedding proposal. At the time that Pattie was still in Los Angeles, it had already been widely reported in the English newspapers. She was unaware of its existence. Immediately following the wedding, she embarked on a tour with Eric, and the two of them appeared to be content. However, less than a week later, Eric informed her that she should pack her bags and return home. Almost immediately, she became aware of the fact that the model with whom Eric had been having an affair had returned and had checked into the hotel where they were staying. Things had already undergone a significant transformation, despite the fact that the crew eventually got rid of the woman. Additionally, throughout the course of their marriage, the other woman would make multiple appearances, which served as a constant reminder of Eric's betrayal. And yet, Pattie continued to remain in the marriage in spite of everything. The wedding reception that Eric and Pattie planned to host at their home was attended by a large number of their musician friends, including all of the members of the Beatles, with the exception of John Lennon, who later stated that he would have attended if he had been aware of the ceremony. Many people believed that it was the most similar thing to a Beatles reunion. Subsequently, Eric eased the restriction that prohibited his wives and girlfriends from accompanying him on tour. However, Pattie made the decision not to travel with him to Milan. The invitation to dinner that Eric extended to her one evening after the tour was something that she considered to be a romantic gesture. Nevertheless, he surprised her by revealing that he had met another woman in Milan and believed that he was in love with her as well. This revelation took place at the restaurant. She went by the name of Lori Del Santo. In light of the fact that they had been undergoing in vitro fertilization, IVF treatments, in an effort to conceive a child, Pattie was devastated by the news. In an effort to maintain her role as a devoted wife, she pretended that the situation was not occurring and told herself that all she wanted was to start a family. Nonetheless, Eric revealed yet another shocking revelation just a few days before Christmas. Lori was carrying a child. Pattie was even more devastated by this news. While Eric was gushing about how stunning Lori was and how wonderful her photographs were, it appeared as though he was completely unaware of the fact that Pattie was also making her debut as a photographer. However, despite the fact that this seemed to be the final blow to their marriage, she continued to stay with him for a while longer. Pattie left and went to stay with a friend in the south of France around the time that Lori's baby was due to be born. After receiving a phone call from Eric informing her that their son, Connor, had been born, he once again anticipated that she would be happy for him, despite the fact that she was unable to conceive. Pattie was surrounded by friends who were either expecting children or already had children, and she began to contemplate the possibility that she would never have a child of her own. For the first time in her life, she gave herself permission to cry uncontrollably. She was 42 years old, and her marriage was in the process of disintegrating. During the time that she was there, Bill Wyman, who lived in the neighborhood, sought refuge at the establishment. His house was surrounded by paparazzi after it became public knowledge that he was involved in a romantic relationship with a young girl whom he had first met when she was only 14 years old. Bill stayed with them for 10 days, during which time he turned their problems into things that they could laugh about and provided them with some much-needed cheer. After the break, Pattie felt more energized, and she went back to her house with the intention of keeping herself busy. While this was going on, Eric had resumed his drinking habits and proposed the idea of Pattie assisting him in the upbringing of Connor. She was so eager to have a child that she initially agreed to continue with in vitro fertilization, IVF treatments. However, their efforts to conceive a child were unsuccessful. The further Eric traveled to see his son, Connor, the more heartbroken Pattie became over the fact that she was unable to conceive a child. As a result of the overwhelming pain, she requested a divorce. Eric became so angry that he threw her belongings out the window on her 43rd birthday. This was in response to her refusal to have sexual relations with him. Scared to death, she ran away and stayed with her friends until she was able to find a place to live. Pattie struggled to rebuild her life through photography, eventually joining the Royal Photographic Society and beginning to look for work. She felt lost and had no income, but she eventually succeeded in doing either of these things. For the first time in her life, she also started a relationship with an old friend named Rod. This was her first experience living on her own. Despite the fact that she had a troubled history, Pattie managed to keep friendly relationships with both George and Eric, and she even managed to forgive them. She was able to meet Eric's son, Connor, before his untimely death, and Eric would take her out to lunch on a regular basis. When Pattie looked back on her life, she felt regret that she had not been able to advocate for herself sooner, but she was able to find peace through self-awareness. The friendship between Eric Clapton and George Harrison persisted in spite of the drama that occurred with Pattie. They continued to collaborate on musical projects until George's passing in the year 2001. The concert for George was a tribute that was held in 2002 to honor George Harrison. It was a celebration of the profound friendship that existed between the two of them. Their mutual respect and love of music resulted in the creation of a legacy that will endure and continue to inspire others, despite the personal challenges they faced. The friendship that exists between Clapton and Harrison serves as a potent reminder of the complexities that are inherent in human connections. These connections are characterized by the intertwining of love, respect, and music, which has the potential to endure even the most challenging obstacles that life may throw at them. Fans from all over the world continue to find inspiration and resonance in their music, which was initially influenced by their relationship. That wraps up this video, in case you were wondering. Be sure to check out some of our other videos if you are interested in viewing additional incredible content similar to this one. Goodbye!